You've probably heard of anti-inflammatory diets, but which ones are the best for people with IBS? Today, I'll talk about the most popular anti-inflammatory diets, the Mediterranean diet, the Paleo diet, and the Low FODMAP diet. And I'll share my experience as a dietitian with IBS. I'm Veronica. I'm a registered dietitian with personal experience of IBS. I help women with IBS take back control of their gut health through healthy recipes and practical nutrition tips. So let's get into this video. So first, what does inflammation have to do with IBS? So inflammation is actually a part of IBS, and I just recently learned this by doing a little research. I found a research article that was published in 2018 in the Journal of Inflammation Research, and they found that this review article is actually inflammation. It's a chronic low grade inflammation found in the intestinal mucosal membrane. So basically, the inner lining of our intestines. Now, this is not to be confused with inflammatory bowel disease or IBD. I'm talking about IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome. IBD has actually higher levels of inflammation compared to IBS. But it is interesting to see that even IBS, there is chronic low grade inflammation. And this chronic low grade inflammation is thought to perpetuate the symptoms of IBS, which is bloating, gas, abdominal pain, constipation, or diarrhea. So even though it's low grade, it can continue to cause these symptoms in people with IBS. They also found that there's low grade chronic inflammation which is in the neural pathways. So the neuroinflammation, or you may have heard of the gut-brain axis in IBS, which is basically that gut-brain connection. We have nerves that go along our intestines and connect to our brain, and there is inflammation along these nerve endings and nerve pathways. So again, this can also explain why people with IBS have these symptoms and triggers with certain foods and stress, where people without IBS do not get these symptoms. And this is why food choices matter. So choosing a low inflammatory or anti-inflammatory diet can be really helpful for people with IBS. So first I'm going to talk about the Mediterranean diet. The Mediterranean diet core foods are olive oil, fish, legumes, whole grains, vegetables, and fruits, also nuts and seeds. So the Mediterranean diet, the pros are that these are whole anti-inflammatory foods. So if you have IBS, you may find that eating these foods really improves your symptoms. The con is that there still are some foods on this diet that can trigger symptoms in some people with IBS. So, for example, there's certain vegetables that can trigger symptoms like garlic, which is very common on the Mediterranean diet. Also, legumes. Some people can really have a lot of bloating and gas with legumes. Again, this can trigger abdominal pain in people with IBS. So, the Mediterranean diet may not work for everybody with IBS. The next diet that I want to talk about is the Paleo Diet. This is basically based on foods that people in the Paleolithic era ate. So all the foods were whole foods because they didn't have any processing back then. So there were no processed foods. So basically, they were eating meat, fish, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and seeds. What they didn't eat was dairy. And then they also did not eat any grains. So that makes it interesting because a lot of the foods that people with IBS have trouble digesting or cause symptoms can be dairy or also can be grains. So that's why some people with IBS may find they feel a lot better on the paleo diet. I know that when I followed the paleo diet, my bloating went down tremendously. So this was like a major win for me when I did the paleo diet. However, the con can be that you can still get symptoms with the paleo diet. And the reason for this may be, again, similar to the Mediterranean diet, is that there are certain foods on the paleo diet that can still trigger symptoms. So certain vegetables, certain fruits can still trigger symptoms in some people. So again, the paleo diet may not be the full answer for some people. So the next diet I'm going to talk about is the low FODMAP diet. This diet was specifically researched for people with IBS. It was researched by Monash University in Australia. And so it was specifically designed for people with IBS. So the low FODMAP diet helps you to find out your trigger foods. And FODMAPs are fermentable carbohydrates. So there are certain carbohydrates that can cause more gas, more bloating, abdominal pain, and again, constipation or diarrhea. So the first phase of the low FODMAP diet is the elimination phase. And this is where you'll only eat low FODMAP foods. And this is done over 2 to 6 weeks. I actually have a video that I created on the beginner's guide to the low FODMAP diet, so make sure you check that out. But basically, by doing this diet, you'll be able to find out which foods cause you triggers or trigger your symptoms. And so that's the second phase of the diet, is reintroducing each food one at a time so you can figure out which foods cause your symptoms. So the pro of this diet is basically that this diet was designed specifically for people with IBS, whereas the other diets were not. So research has shown that it can be effective in reducing symptoms in up to 86% of people that follow this diet, which is great. The con is that you can still actually eat some processed foods on this diet that are technically low in FODMAPs. So it could still trigger symptoms in some people. Another con is that it's kind of difficult to follow, or at least can be difficult if you don't have a registered dietitian to work with. So I do recommend working with a registered dietitian to help you with this diet, because it can be a little complicated for some people. I would say the low FODMAP diet is probably the most beneficial, or at least the most researched on the effects of IBS. However, my take on it is that when I compare the paleo and actually ate a paleo diet, I really saw a reduction in my bloating symptoms tremendously. It wasn't 100% though. So then that's when I added in the low FODMAP diet. So basically, a combination of the paleo and low FODMAP diet is what really resolved a lot of my symptoms. Now, a con of this is that it's pretty restrictive. So, you may find a hard time sticking to this because it is restrictive. So, this is what I found in my personal experience. Now, I do recommend that you experiment and find what works best for you, because this is just my journey and what helped me. I also do, like I said, recommend you work one on one with a registered dietitian that can help you to tailor your diet specifically to you. Because that's the thing with IBS. Certain foods that I eat that trigger symptoms in me may not trigger symptoms in you, or vice versa. So you do really need to work with someone to really nail down your diet and help you find the best foods that work for you. Now, if you do need a little help, I do have a low FODMAP shopping guide. You can take this list of foods to the grocery store, and all these foods are low FODMAP, so you don't have to worry about it. You can just take this with you and know that everything on that list is low in FODMAPs. I'll put a link to that in the description below. I also have a quick start ebook. So this is a guide to the low FODMAP diet, where I have meal plans, recipes, and simple tricks and tips that can help you as far as swapping out some of those high FODMAP foods for low FODMAP foods. I'll also put a link to that in the description below. And one last thing, I have a blog. My blog has recipes, paleo recipes, low FODMAP recipes. I also have a lot of nutrition articles on IBS that I wrote that is on my blog. So be sure to check that out. My blog is called Nosh Nourish Wander. So I'll put a link to that as well. So that's it for today. Let me know if you have any questions. You can put questions in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe and like this video so that you can find out when my next video is coming out. All right, thanks so much. See you later. Bye.